The phrase "Trail of Tears" was not coined by the Cherokee. It was spoken by a Choctaw chief 7 years before the Cherokee removal to a newspaper reporter in Arkansas, describing a winter march that had already killed a quarter of his people. Most Americans learn a version of this story that begins in 1838 with soldiers at cabin doors and a single desperate march west. That version is not false. But it starts about 36 years too late, it names the wrong president, and it locates most of the deaths in the wrong place. The real origin of the Trail of Tears is not a march, it is a contract, and the men who signed it did so before Andrew Jackson had ever held public office. The story begins in 1802. At that time, the state of Georgia claimed enormous stretches of land running west toward the Mississippi River. The federal government wanted that claim resolved, so the two sides made a deal, known afterward as the Georgia Compact. Georgia surrendered its western claims, land that would later become Alabama and Mississippi. In exchange, the United States government made a promise. It would extinguish all Indian land title within Georgia's remaining borders, and it would do so, in the language of the agreement, as early as the same can be peaceably obtained on reasonable terms. Read that phrase carefully, because everything that follows lives inside it. Peaceably, on reasonable terms. Those words were meant as a limit. Georgia would read them for the next 3 decades as a deadline that the federal government kept refusing to meet. Here is what makes the compact so consequential. It created a debt. Not a debt of money, but a debt of land, owed by the United States to a single state, and payable only in territory that belonged to somebody else. Every governor of Georgia for the next 30 years inherited that unpaid bill, and every one of them pressed Washington to settle it. If you find forgotten history like this worth digging into, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps, and it lets me keep working on stories that take this much research. Because in 1829, something happened in North Georgia that turned a slow bureaucratic grievance into an emergency: gold. The discovery near what is now Dahlonega, Georgia, set off one of the first gold rushes in American history. Thousands of prospectors poured into the mountains. The problem was that the gold was on Cherokee land, protected by federal treaty, and the miners did not care. Within months, North Georgia held more armed trespassers than the Cherokee Nation had men to remove them. Georgia's response was not to remove the miners, it was to remove the law protecting the Cherokee. The state legislature passed a series of acts that are worth describing precisely because they are usually skipped. Georgia declared Cherokee law void inside its borders. It abolished the Cherokee government. It prohibited the Cherokee National Council from meeting except to discuss ceding land. It forbade any Cherokee person from testifying in court against a white person. And it required white men living in Cherokee territory to swear a loyalty oath to the state of Georgia. That last provision seems minor. It is the one that eventually reached the Supreme Court. Now consider what the Cherokee Nation actually was in 1829, because this is the part that most badly contradicts the popular image. The Cherokee had a written constitution, adopted in 1827 and modeled closely on the United States Constitution. They had a bicameral legislature, a Supreme Court, and a capital at New Echota. They had a written alphabet, the syllabary created by Sequoyah, and literacy rates that in some surveys exceeded those of neighboring white settlements. They published a newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix, printed in 2 languages. They had farms, mills, roads, and taverns. A portion of the Cherokee elite owned plantations and owned enslaved black people to work them. This matters because the standard justification for removal was that these were nomadic peoples who did not use the land. That argument collapses on contact with the evidence. The Cherokee were removed not because they had failed to assimilate, but in significant part because they had succeeded, and their success made the land more valuable and their claim harder to dismiss. Which brings us to the law everyone remembers, and almost everyone misreads. The Indian Removal Act, signed in May of 1830, does not order anyone removed. Read the text. It authorizes the president to exchange land west of the Mississippi for land held by tribes in the east, and to assist those who choose to go. It is written entirely in the language of voluntary agreement. There is no forced march in it. There is no army in it. What the act actually did was fund and empower a negotiation process. Everything violent that followed happened in the gap between what that law permitted and how it was carried out, and it barely passed. In the House of Representatives, the vote was 102 to 97, a 5-vote margin. The debate ran for weeks and was ferocious. Theodore Frelinghuysen of New Jersey spoke against it for 6 hours across 3 days. Davy Crockett, a Tennessee congressman and a frontiersman by reputation, broke with Jackson to vote no and told his constituents he would rather be honestly damned than hypocritically immortalized. He lost his seat in the next election. So the Cherokee had a hostile state, a narrow federal law, and a president openly sympathetic to Georgia. What they did next is the most consistently underreported part of this story. They did not fight, they sued. The Cherokee Nation hired William Wirt, who had served as Attorney General of the United States for 12 years under 2 presidents. He was among the most respected constitutional lawyers in the country. Their strategy was to defeat Georgia in the American legal system using American law in American courts. The first attempt failed. In Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, decided in 1831, Chief Justice John Marshall dismissed the case on jurisdictional grounds. The Cherokee had sued as a foreign nation. Marshall ruled they were something else, a category he invented in that opinion and that still governs federal Indian law today. He called them domestic dependent nations and described their relationship to the United States as resembling that of a ward to a guardian. The Cherokee lost. But Marshall's language left an opening, and Wirt found it. The following year, a second case arrived. Samuel Worcester was a white missionary living among the Cherokee who had refused to swear Georgia's loyalty oath. He was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to 4 years of hard labor. As a white citizen, he could bring the exact case the Cherokee could not. In 1832, the Supreme Court ruled in Worcester versus Georgia that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct community with defined boundaries in which the laws of Georgia had no force whatsoever. Georgia's entire legal apparatus for seizing Cherokee land was struck down. The Cherokee had won, completely, at the highest court in the country. You have likely heard what Andrew Jackson supposedly said in response, that John Marshall had made his decision and could now enforce it himself. There is no contemporary record of Jackson saying that. The quote surfaces decades later in a journalist's account, and historians treat it as apocryphal. But the substance was real enough. Georgia ignored the ruling, Worcester stayed in prison for another year, and the federal government did nothing to compel compliance. That is the true turning point, not a law, not a march, but a moment when a Supreme Court decision was allowed to mean nothing. After Worcester, the Cherokee Nation split. Not into those who wanted to leave and those who wanted to stay, but into those who believed the law would eventually protect them, and those who had concluded it never would. Principal Chief John Ross led the first group. Ross was 7/8 Scottish by ancestry, spoke limited Cherokee, and had the overwhelming support of the Cherokee people. His position was that the nation would not sell its land under any circumstances and that continued legal and political pressure would eventually work. The second group formed around Major Ridge, a war leader who had fought alongside Jackson at Horseshoe Bend, his son John Ridge, educated in Connecticut, and his nephew Elias Boudinot, the editor of the Cherokee Phoenix. Their reasoning was grim and arithmetic. Georgia was already seizing homes by lottery. The federal government would not intervene. If removal was inevitable, then negotiating terms now was better than being driven out later with nothing. They came to be called the Treaty Party. They numbered a few hundred people at most, out of a nation of roughly 16,000. In December of 1835, federal commissioners called a council at New Echota. The Cherokee government did not recognize it. John Ross was in Washington. Estimates of attendance vary, but only a few hundred Cherokee came, and roughly 20 men ultimately signed. That document is the Treaty of New Echota. It ceded all remaining Cherokee land east of the Mississippi for $5 million in territory in what is now Oklahoma. Not one signer held any authority under Cherokee law to cede land. Boudinot said afterward that he had signed his own death warrant. He was being literal, and I will come back to why. John Ross responded by gathering signatures. The petition he carried to the Senate opposing the treaty bore more than 15,000 Cherokee names, an overwhelming majority of every man, woman, and child in the nation. The Senate ratified the treaty anyway, in May of 1836, by a single vote. The Cherokee were given 2 years to leave voluntarily. Almost none did. They believed, right up to the end, that a treaty signed by 20 unauthorized men could not possibly be enforced against a nation of 16,000. Here's a fact that quietly rearranges the entire popular version of this story. Andrew Jackson was not president when the Trail of Tears happened. He left office in March of 1837, more than a year before a single Cherokee was forced to move. The removal was ordered, funded, and carried out under Martin Van Buren. In May of 1838, Winfield Scott arrived in Cherokee territory with roughly 7,000 federal troops and state militia. And now, the correction that matters most. Most of the dying did not happen on the trail. Scott's men worked in squads, moving from farm to farm. Families were taken from fields and dinner tables, sometimes with minutes to gather belongings, often with none. Behind them came looters who took the livestock, dug up graves for silver, and burned what was left. Then the captured families were marched not west, but into stockades. There were more than 30 of these internment camps across Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, and North Carolina. Thousands of people were confined in open pens through the summer of 1838. The water was contaminated. There was no sanitation. Dysentery moved through the camps first, then measles, then whooping cough. A severe drought that summer made the rivers too low for the water route west, so the confinement stretched on for months. By the time the detachments finally departed, an enormous share of the dead were already dead. The march west compounded a catastrophe that the stockades had begun. The number you have probably heard is 4,000. That figure traces to a single estimate made in 1839 by Dr. Elizur Butler, a missionary who traveled with one detachment. It is one man's approximation, and it has been repeated for nearly 2 centuries. Later demographic work, most notably by the anthropologist Russell Thornton, puts total Cherokee population loss substantially higher, closer to 8,000 when you account for the children who were never born. There is one more group almost entirely missing from the standard account. Cherokee slaveholders brought enslaved black people with them on the removal. Those men, women, and children walked the same roads through the same winter, and their deaths are recorded almost nowhere. And there is a final detail that is rarely told. After the first federally supervised detachments produced catastrophic losses, John Ross negotiated with Scott for the Cherokee Nation to conduct its own removal. From late 1838 onward, the remaining detachments were organized and led by Cherokee officials. Ross's own wife, Quaddy, died on the journey. The story does not end at the destination. On the morning of June 22, 1839, in Indian Territory, 3 separate groups of Cherokee men set out before dawn. John Ridge was pulled from his bed in front of his wife and children and stabbed to death in his own yard. Elias Boudinot was lured away from a house he was building on the pretext of needing medicine and killed with a knife and a hatchet. Major Ridge was ambushed on the road to Arkansas and shot from horseback, all 3 within hours of each other, all 3 signers of the Treaty of New Echota. Cherokee law had long carried a provision that any person who ceded national land without the authority of the National Council would be put to death. Major Ridge had helped write that law. He was executed under it. John Ross denied ordering the killings, and no direct evidence has ever tied him to them. But the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma descended into intermittent civil violence that lasted more than a decade and did not fully settle until the 1840s. And the removal itself did not stop with the Cherokee. The Choctaw had gone first in the winter of 1831. The Creek were removed under military escort in 1836, many of them in chains. The Chickasaw removal followed. The Seminole refused entirely and fought the longest and most expensive Indian war in United States history, one that never produced a formal surrender. So, what do historians get wrong? Not the facts, in most cases. What the popular version gets wrong is the shape. It compresses a 50-year policy into one winter. It assigns the blame to one president who had left office before the marching began. It puts the deaths on a road when most of them happened in stockades. It credits the Cherokee with a phrase the Choctaw spoke first, and it frames the whole thing as an inevitable collision between civilization and wilderness, when the Cherokee Nation had a constitution, a Supreme Court, and a printing press, and lost anyway. The most uncomfortable part is not that the law failed, it is that the law worked, and it did not matter. The Cherokee took their case to the highest court in the country, argued it through a former attorney general, and won. The ruling was simply not enforced. A treaty signed by 20 men without authority was ratified over a petition bearing 15,000 names. The Trail of Tears did not begin when the soldiers arrived. It began in 1802 with a promise made by one government to one state about land belonging to people who were not in the room. Thank you for watching. If you find value in history told through the actual documents, the court records, the treaty texts, and the numbers underneath the familiar story, consider subscribing for more investigations like this one, and I would like to hear from you. Do you think the popular version of the Trail of Tears is a simplification or a genuine distortion? Let me know in the comments, and I will see you in the next one.